Hi, I'm Katie Stone. Welcome to Dystopia. This is the 8th in a series of videos designed to open new pathways into the genre for those unsure where to begin, or for the hardened dystopians out there to offer an opportunity to return to first principles and try and work out what drew you to dystopianism in the first place. There are more learning resources, reading lists and ways to get more involved on my website at katiemcgregorstone.co.uk, but for now, wherever you are on your journey with dystopianism, and however much time and energy you have for this today, you're welcome. So, in this video, as in my previous one, I'll be talking about time in dystopias, how time is controlled in dystopias, the real life forms of control of time that inspire dystopian creators, and hopefully the ways in which dystopias can help us to imagine better times. Similarly, as in the previous video, I'm going to be talking about Boots Riley's 2018 film Sorry to Bother You. Sorry to Bother You is a near-future dystopia set in Oakland, California. It follows Lakeith Stanfield, who plays Cassius Green, as he tries to get a job in a future where unemployment and homelessness is even more widespread than it is today. Cassius manages to get a job as a telemarketer, and then as he rises through the ranks of the telemarketing firm, we see him learn more and more about the different forms and extents of exploitation of workers in this world, as well as encounter different forms of resistance, from union organising to direct action to a larger scale uprising at the end of the film. I'm going to start off by talking about time theft. This is the corporate management term for workers slacking off during working hours, not doing enough work in the opinion of their employers. But in this video, I'm going to be thinking about who is really stealing whose time in the capitalist work environment. And in order to do this, I'm going to be taking a deeper look at Karl Marx's Capital Volume 1. I'm only going to be talking about Volume 1 because I've only read Volume 1, Cards on the Table. But I mentioned Marx in my previous video when I was talking about exploitation, and I'm going to return to Capital now to think a bit more about specifically how the labourer's time is affected by the system of capitalist exploitation. So for those who aren't familiar with his work, Karl Marx was a German political economist and philosopher, the father of what is now known as Marxism, and even Volume 1 of Capital is a very big book which has been hugely influential in the 150 years since its publication. I certainly won't be trying to summarise everything that it says today, but what I will be trying to do is pick out the moments when Marx, in what is at times a history of the development of capitalism, a study of particular abuses under capitalism, a survey of previous economists' work, and his own economic ideas, I'll be focusing in on specifically his ideas about time and about how capitalism affects time. So I'll start off by putting forward, I think, that the core of capital's effect on the worker's time. Then I'm going to apply those ideas to Sorry to Bother You, see where we can see them showing up in a dystopian form. I'm going to look at some of the potential tensions between the dystopia of Sorry to Bother You and Marx's ideas, and see if we can resolve those tensions. And then I'm going to end, as always, I hope, on a more utopian note, and look at how Marx sees an end to the time of capital, how he sees better times to come. So to begin, Marx is thinking about, one of Marx's key innovations when he's thinking about capital is that he's not just interested in the market. So he says that previous political economies have been very focused on the idea of the new thing with capital is that everything is a commodity, everything can be bought and sold, so exchange is really what's important about capitalism, as opposed to, say, feudalism. Marx thinks that the market is important, but he thinks that the most important commodity that is exchanged on the market is labour power, that is the ability of workers to work. So what he's more interested in, I think, is production, and he sees production as being really key to how capitalism works. So how are things made? What is it that the workers are doing after they've sold their labour power? And this has a direct impact on time. Marx writes, suppose that a capitalist pays for a day's labour power at its value. Then the right to use that power for a day belongs to him, just as much as the right to use any other commodity, such as a horse that he has hired for the day. So we see Marx using this deliberately dehumanizing language in order to stress the significance of the effect this will have on the labourer, the fact that they have sold their time, that time is now no longer their own. So they haven't just sold their skill to the capitalist or the product of their labour. The capitalist cares how they are spending that time. They are not free to do with it as they wish. What Marx points out is that means this is in the capitalist's interest now to squeeze as much work out of that time as they possibly can. He talks about instances on this. He's often quoting from the reports of the inspector of factories, who were people who would go around the different factories in Victorian England and see what the working conditions were like there, because there were so many abuses. So this is from a report written on the 30th of April 1858, and the inspector writes, I continue to receive about the usual number of complaints that half or 3/4 of an hour in the day are snatched from the workers by encroaching upon the times professedly allowed for rest and refreshment. So we see this idea that the capitalists are kind of eating away at the time of the workers, trying to eke out as many hours of the working day as being physically at work, stopping workers from resting, from eating. Marx writes, these small thefts of capital from the labourers' meal and recreation time, the factory inspectors also designate as petty pilferings of minutes, snatching a few minutes, or, as the labourers technically called them, nibbling and cribbling at meal times. So we see here the question of who's stealing whose time is really brought to the fore. Marx is pointing out that it's not the labourers who are stealing from the capitalists, it's the capitalists who, having bought a day's labour, but with the agreement that the labourer would get a certain amount of break time, then really eat into that time. So I've included this still from Charlie Chaplin's film Modern Times, which I do recommend if you're interested in labour and time. But here Chaplin's employer in the factory is experimenting with a machine which is designed to feed the workers as they work. So approach Chaplin here with this corn on the cob while he's still on the production line. His hands could still be working. So this is precisely one of the small thefts of capital that Marx is talking about. And we could think also of people eating at their desks while they work, or maybe of employees in Amazon warehouses and other exploitative sites where every second of the worker is logged. So every second that they stop to take a drink of water or to use the bathroom or to have a cigarette is logged and counted against them, and they're potentially fined for those times. And Marx talks about the effect, both kind of psychological and to the very identity of the workers, that this kind of theft of time has. He writes, nothing is from this point of view more characteristic than the designation of the workers who work full-time as full-timers, and the children under 13 who are only allowed to work 6 hours as half-timers. The worker is here nothing more than personified labour time. So you see how this pressure that's put on the time of the workers, so that every second should be productive, is something that kind of feeds into their very identity. So they stop being people, right? They become labour time personified. They just become vehicles for the creation of profit. And a lot of Capital is about the fight for the working day, and the fact that lots of workers and lots of workers organising was oriented around trying to make sure that the working day wasn't 12 hours but could be the reasonable 10 hours, and that children, as we see here, could be that their working time could be cut down, because if the capitalist factory owners had their way, everyone would be working all of the time, no matter their age. So Marx is particularly interested in the effect that machines have on time and on the time of labourers specifically. He sees the adoption of more and more machines into the labour process as part of the development of capitalism. And he talks about the paradoxical effect that this introduction of more and more machinery has on the time of the workers. He says, if machinery be the most powerful means for increasing the productiveness of labour, for shortening the working time required in the production of a commodity, it becomes in the hands of capital the most powerful means in those industries first invaded by it for lengthening the working day beyond all bounds set by human nature. So what Marx is saying here is that introducing machines should cut down on the amount of working time people have to do, right? It used to take someone an hour to hammer out a sheet of steel. A machine can do that same work in a minute. So that hour should then be free to do other things, right? But Marx says, no, that's not the effect that this has in capitalism, because the machines can work all of the time. That means that the factory owners then want the workers to work all of the time. So we see much more night work and shift work and pressure to work longer and longer hours, essentially pressure to keep up with the machine. Marx says, to work at a machine, the workman should be taught from childhood in order that he may learn to adapt his own movements to the uniform and unceasing motion of an automaton. See, Marx doesn't think this is a good idea. He's speaking in the voice of the factory owner. In handicrafts and manufacture, the workman makes use of a tool. In the factory, the machine makes use of him. So we see this idea that rather than machines serving the needs of people, people are made to work at the speed of a machine and in the manner of the machine, meant to change their bodies so that they're moving with the rhythm of the machine rather than the machine serving the people. And we see this explored in Sorry to Bother You, particularly in this little claymation advert that we see for the company Worry Free. So I talked a little bit about Worry Free in my previous video, but essentially it's a company that Boots Riley has imagined where workers contract with Worry Free for life, and they say, okay, I'm going to work for you forever, and in exchange they get room and board. And it's pointed out that this is an incredibly exploitative form of labour, which in essence is enslaving people because they're expected to work for free. They don't get any wages, so they can't possibly earn enough to get out of that situation. That's it for them forever. So their freedom is massively curtailed. But Worry Free isn't happy with just having bought the entire lifetimes of these workers, this really extreme form of exploitation. They don't just want to stop there. They want to adapt the workers to the labour process even more than they already have. So we see this in this commercial. The narrator says, "What are tools if not extensions of the appendages with which we were born? Humans have modified ourselves throughout history. Worry-free is carrying forward this lineage of natural developments that began in prehistoric times. We realize that human labor has its limitations, and so our scientists have discovered a way, a chemical change, to make humans stronger, more obedient, more durable, and therefore more efficient and profitable." So essentially what's presented here is a narrative of kind of natural development. Oh, humans, that's what they naturally do. They use tools. And that's all that we're doing here at Worry Free. We're just making the workers stronger, much as a hammer allows the worker to do more than they would be able to do with their bare hands. Well, now their bare hands can do that because we're adapting their genetics to make them better. But what I think is particularly horrible about the adaptation of workers that we see here, where they're essentially turned into what Boots Riley calls equisapiens, horse people, is that it's not their needs that are being served by this adaptation. They don't want to be stronger. It doesn't allow them to do more things than they previously want to do. All it allows them to do is to be better workers, to be, as it says in this commercial, more efficient and profitable. Cassius says, "So you're making half human, half horse things so you can make more money?" And Steve Liff, the CEO of Worry Free, says, "Yeah, basically. I just didn't want you to think I was crazy, that I was doing this for no reason, because this isn't irrational." And that shows an important thing that Boots Riley is doing with dystopianism here. He's exaggerating, right, the processes of capitalist exploitation. He's taking them to their logical conclusion. But he's not just making up something that's really weird for the sake of it. He's not creating in Steve Lift just a villain who does mad, weird stuff because he thinks it's fun. So even though there is a surreal quality to the equisapiens, they serve a purpose under capitalism, right? They've not been produced for no reason. This isn't irrational. This is just capitalism. So I want to turn now to the question of the future of labour as it's imagined by Marx in Capital and as it's imagined in Sorry to Bother You. And there's a potential tension here that we're going to try and work out. Marx is here again talking about what happens when you introduce machinery into the factory. And he writes, "Insofar as machinery dispenses with muscular power, it becomes of a means of employing labourers of slight muscular strength and those whose bodily development is incomplete but whose limbs are all the more supple. The labour of women and children was therefore the first thing sought for by capitalists who used machinery." So what we see here is the idea that the more machines you have, the less you need to depend on the physical strength of workers. So a child might not be able to do some of the physically demanding labour that was required in earlier forms of production, but they could feed a machine coal, which would then do that work. So it really minimises the amount that each individual worker has to depend on their muscles. In contrast, in Sorry to Bother You, we see the future of labour personified by the equisapiens. Steve Liff, the Worry Free CEO, says of the equisapiens, that is the future of labour, okay? They're bigger, they're stronger, they hopefully gripe a lot less. So this is a big difference from Marx's vision of the future of labour under capitalism, and we can think of plenty of reasons for this difference. Obviously, Riley is producing Sorry to Bother You 150 years after Marx is writing Capital. Riley is also very tapped into the black radical tradition and the history of enslavement in the Americas as a central part of the history of capitalist exploitation, and that's something that Marx touches on but really doesn't spend a lot of time with, so that might be part of the answer. Or we might just say they're two different people with two very different political visions. And we could just let those differences be. And that's okay when we're applying one text to another. We are looking for similarities and ways to use one to shine a light on the other and help us to understand it. But we can also say that they don't fit perfectly together. But if we were to try to make these two visions fit together, I think we can have a go at resolving some of these issues. And we can do that by looking back at a different section of Capital. In this section, Marx is providing kind of a case study of women's working conditions in England in the 19th century. So he writes, in England, women are still occasionally used instead of horses for hauling canal boats, because the labour required to produce horses and machines is an accurately known quantity, while that required to maintain the women of the surplus population is below all calculation. So in this moment, I think he's really shining a light on the fact that the introduction of machinery or even horsepower into processes of production doesn't necessarily mean that no people have to do hard, back-breaking labour anymore. He says that that labour could be better done by horses or by machines, but it's possible that it might not be able to be more cheaply done by horses and machines. That the labour, if labour is cheap enough, that means that the time of people is valued at less than the time of a horse, the time of a machine. So we see that, I think, in the Equisapiens, is that their labour, because they've contracted with worry-free, is now very cheap. Their time is valued very cheaply, so they can be used to replace a more expensive machine, even though in some ways that seems like a kind of regression, going backwards and becoming less efficient. If it's more profitable, it's still something that capitalists are likely to exploit. So what does Marx mean when he says that the woman we just saw pulling a canal boat is part of the surplus population? I think this is an important element of Capital, where Marx explains that there is an idea that under capitalism everyone should have a job, right? Everyone should try and get a job, and if you haven't got a job, that's because you're lazy or you're a failure in some way. But ideal world, everyone has a job. And Marx says that this isn't true, that capitalism actually depends upon a large number of people being surplus to the requirements of capital, so being kind of extra people who don't have jobs. It requires unemployment. He says it is capitalistic accumulation itself that constantly produces a relatively redundant population of labourers, i.e. a population of greater extent than suffices for the average needs of the self-expansion of capital. So to break that down a little bit, there's a certain number of people. To have a capitalist system, you've got to have workers, right? To run the factories, you need to have people working in them. So there's a certain number of people that are considered to be necessary. But Marx says there is always more than that. There's always more than that. And some people, and Malthus is one of these people who Marx talks about quite a lot in Capital and who he critiques. Malthus is someone who talks a lot about overpopulation and tries to say there's too many people because poor people are having too many children, right? But Marx says that's not right, that capital itself is as producing this surplus population, that these people, even though they're not necessary, as he says, to the self-expansion of capital, actually are necessary to the process of capital's growth. So he says this surplus population becomes the lever of capitalist accumulation, nay, a condition of existence of the capitalist mode of production. It forms a disposable industrial reserve army that belongs to capital quite as absolutely as if the latter had bred it at its own cost. Again, this dehumanization of people. Independently of the limits of the actual increase of population, it creates, for the changing needs of the self-expansion of capital, a mass of human material always ready for exploitation. So Marx's chief example when he's trying to explain this is the building of the railroads over England. You have this leap forward in technology, which means that train travel by steam train is now possible, and it's possible to make a profit off it. But obviously for trains and the owner of train companies to make a profit, there need to be train tracks, right? So who's going to lay those train tracks? Now, if everyone had a job already, if everyone was already fully employed, then it would be very hard to convince them to leave their homes, their communities, and live in temporary rubbish accommodation all over the UK, doing back-breaking labour laying train tracks. What you need is a relative surplus population, right? Extra people who don't have a job, and who it's much easier to get them then to do rubbish work, essentially. So if you want to open up a whole new area of industry, you don't have to persuade workers who already have a job to come and work for you by offering them better wages or benefits of other kinds. Instead, there is a whole group of people who desperately need work, and you can offer it to them as if you're offering them kind of a charitable offering, when actually what you're doing is buying their time at much less than its value. So what Marx says this means is that the whole form of the movement of modern industry depends, therefore, upon the constant transformation of a part of the labouring population into unemployed or half-employed hands. In order to be flexible, be able to open up new industries, capital requires the relative surplus population. And we see some of the pressures of unemployment, how that works out in Sorry to Bother You. We see that Cassius is made to feel like a failure because he can't get a job. He goes so far as to forge this Employee of the Month certificate and a debating trophy in order to try and get a job as a telemarketer, which doesn't even offer a salary. So even the worst work is really competitive, basically, precisely because there's so much unemployment, because there is this surplus population. And Marx talks about how the idea of necessary people and surplus people really drives a wedge between the working class and causes competition internally to that class. So he writes, the overwork of the employed part of the working class swells the ranks of the reserve, whilst conversely the greater pressure that the latter by its competition exerts on the former forces these to submit to overwork and to subjugation under the dictates of capital. The condemnation of one part of the working class to enforced idleness by the overwork of the other part, and the converse, becomes a means of enriching the individual capitalists. So what Marx is saying here is that the more that the employed fear becoming part of the unemployed, fear becoming surplus, they work harder, right, to try and keep their jobs because they're scared of losing them. They know that there are other people ready to replace them. But the fact that they're working harder means they're doing more work, means that there's less need for more employees, there's fewer jobs. So we see how this is a kind of vicious cycle. And again, we see this in Sorry to Bother You. We see the work as being driven apart. We see how difficult it is to do labour organising, to keep everyone united when you can offer someone a promotion, as happens to Cassius. And he then feels that his interests aren't being represented by the union of other workers. He fears becoming one of them again, becoming lesser paid or becoming unemployed. And so he fights to keep his job. He works more, even as he knows the system is exploitative. So these are the kind of different forms of exploitation of time that we see in dystopias, we see being critiqued in dystopias, and we see in Marxist thought. Hopefully that all makes sense, and I'm going to leave you now with some, I think, more hopeful words from Marx. They don't start out hopeful, but they get more hopeful. So Marx writes, "Within the capitalist system, all methods for raising the social productiveness of labour are brought about at the cost of the individual labourer. All means for the development of production transform themselves into means of domination over and exploitation of the producers. They mutilate the labourer into a fragment of a man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work and turn it into hated toil. They transform his lifetime into working time. Along with the constantly diminishing number of the magnates of capital who usurp and monopolize all advantages of capitalism, the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. With this too grows the revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers and disciplined, united, organised by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated." So those are all of my thoughts on time and dystopianism. As I said before, I'll have more learning resources on my website at katiemcgregorstone.co.uk. But for now, thank you and you're welcome.